Are you ready for the word?
Yes, sir.
Go to Galatians 2. We're going to, we're going to get to a verse by verse teaching of the book of Galatians. And I'm going to begin in the second chapter. Well, we've already gone through the first chapter. But then we spent a lot of time over the last 3 or 4 weeks explaining all the different parts of what we found in the first chapter. Now we're going to go to Galatians 2 and go verse by verse and at least cover the first 14 verses of this chapter. Verse 1, Then 14 years after, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also. So we've already seen from the last few weeks that this meeting and the reason for that meeting in Jerusalem is recorded in the last part of Acts 14 and in Acts 15. Paul said, I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. And I've made this comment at least the last 2 weeks. I think it's one of the most important statements made by Paul that helps us understand Paul, because he made sure that his message was not one iota different than the message the other apostles were preaching. He said if his message had been different than their message, he would have been running in vain. And so verse 2 makes it as clear can be that Paul's message and Peter's message were the same. Paul's message and James' message were the same. They did not vary one iota. Verse 3, But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren unaware brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in Yeshua HaMashiach, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we gave place by subjection, though not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Now, look at verse 4 with me pretty closely here. Does it seem like an incomplete thought to you? If you just read it, to me, it just seemed like an incomplete thought. And it actually is if you separate it from verse 3. Verse 3 is not talking about one thing, and then verse 4 talking about another thing. The reason that they seem to be separated, I think, is because of mistranslation of a couple of Greek words. First of all, in verse 4, it begins with the word and in English. It's the Greek word de, or D-E, and it can be translated and, but its primary meaning is but. And then you see in verse 4, that because, that's translated from one Greek word, dia, D-I-A, dia. And dia means through, where we get our word diameter. What is a diameter of an object? It's the measurement through that object, right? You've got a basketball and you want to know the diameter of it. You measure the distance from this point to this point going through it. That's the diameter. So dia means through, not that because. I don't know how they came up with that because, okay? So if we translate those words properly, here's what verse 4 actually says. But through false brethren unaware brought in. Now you take but through false brethren unaware brought in and tie it back to verse 3, and verse 3 and 4 make complete sense. Here's what Paul is saying. When I arrived in Jerusalem with Titus, he was not compelled to be circumcised, but through false brethren. He was compelled to be circumcised, but it was through false brethren that compelled him to be circumcised. It was not the apostles. It was false brethren who were compelling him to be. Let's stop momentarily and identify the ones Paul's referring to here as false brethren that are thinking that Titus needs to be circumcised for salvation. False brethren, definitely, we know it's not Paul. It's not the apostles in Jerusalem. It's not Peter. It's not James. The ones compelling Titus to be circumcised are false brethren. False means that which is untrue. And to be untrue means to be deceitful. So Paul starts identifying them here. He said they came in privily. Privily means that they pretended to be somebody they were not in order to get in. And then he says, that not only have they come in, but they have come in to spy out. So you have the assembly of Yahweh, which is made up of Peter, of James, of the other apostles, of those who have believed in Yeshua but keep Torah. You have the true assembly in Jerusalem. But then you have those who are of the Jews' religion. We're not going to go back over all of that, but, over the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've talked about those who are of the Jews' religion. They don't follow Torah primarily. Primarily, what do they follow? The traditions of the elders, or the traditions of the fathers, also called the oral law. And Yeshua told us in Mark chapter 7 that when there's a contrast between what the oral law says and what Torah says, they'll take Torah and set it aside. Right? So you've got the true assembly who believes in Yeshua and follows Torah, and then you've got the Jews' religion who sticks more with the oral tradition. All right. Paul is saying there have been some who came out of the Jews' religion into the assembly pretending that they're a part of the assembly. They're false. They're untrue. He said they're pretending for one reason, and that is to spy out. That is, they were laying in wait, inspecting everything done inside the assembly, waiting for an opportunity to attack them over some doctrinal issue. On social media, we call them trolls. Right?
Yeah.
They don't come listen or watch on social media because they desire to learn, keep, or do. They come lying in wait for you to say something wrong so they can attack. That's what Paul said that these false brethren were doing in Jerusalem. These are false brethren. Only a false brother, the message is, only a false brother would tell you that you have to be circumcised to be saved. Nobody else in Jerusalem was telling Titus he had to be circumcised to be saved, but the false brethren rose up and told him he'd have to be circumcised to be saved. Notice how Paul said they dealt with this. Verse 5. To whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Not for an hour is a figure of speech. The word translated hour is even translated, like in Luke 2, it's translated as the word instant. So Paul said, we shut them down immediately. Wasn't even up for debate. We immediately shut them down. As a side note, let me just stop here and say, the only way to properly stop evil is to not give it place by subjection. See that? We gave place, to whom we gave place by subjection, no. To give place means to yield to something or someone, and it implies weakness. You yield because you're weak. And subjection means to submit to that person or to what that person is saying. Paul said we did not show any weakness toward them by submitting to what they were saying, not even for an instant. Immediately, we stood up and resisted what they were saying. My point is, how fast would this shutdown in our country end if we just learned this truth? Yielding in weakness and submitting to things that absolutely make no sense. The only way to stop evil is to face it directly. The more you give up, the more ground they take. That's the way evil advances, is because in weakness we yield to it when we shouldn't yield to it. Anyway, back to Galatians 2. Look in verse 6. But of those who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it makes no matter to me. Yahweh accepts no man's person. For they who seem to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me. Understand that Paul means nothing disrespectful here toward the other apostles. He's just building on what he already said in verse 2. He's simply stating that the messages that he preached and they preached matched up perfectly. Verse 7. But contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of uncircumcision was committed unto me as the gospel of circumcision was unto Peter. He said, on the contrary, I did help them see how that the gospel they preached and the gospel I preach was not just for the Jews, it was for the Gentiles. Their gospel, my gospel, same gospel. And I helped them to see that that wasn't just to be preached to the Jews, the circumcision. It's also to be preached to the uncircumcision. There is only one salvation for everybody, and one way to be saved. And there's only one gospel for everybody, and there's only one Torah for everybody. That's the point. He that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go unto the heathen, and they unto the circumcision. Verse 9, let me say this about that before I move beyond the word grace. We always talk about grace and what it means. Grace, you'll see it used in a lot of places like this, and it's evident that the word grace means an empowerment. It means to be empowered to accomplish something. And so Paul is constantly referring about the grace that's been given to him to accomplish what he does. Grace is the power of YAHWEH being given into a person's life. Anyway, he mentions the right hand of fellowship, and that means that the apostles approve of the message that Paul is preaching. That needs to be forefront when we're studying the writings of Paul. The other apostles approve of the message that Paul is preaching, which they would have never done if he preached that men do not have to keep Torah. If Paul preached that men don't have to keep Torah, the other apostles would not have approved of it. But they listened to what he said he preached, and they joined him in a right hand of fellowship, saying, we're with you. We are together. We're partners in this thing. So they do approve of it. What they agree on is twofold. One, that salvation is by grace through faith. Two, the saved walk in righteousness, which is defined in Torah. Paul never preached anything different. We quoted it earlier. He's preaching the exact same thing that Peter preached. He's preaching the exact same thing James preached. He's preaching the exact same thing John preached. And we quoted it earlier. John said, if you say I know him and you don't keep his commandments. I wonder if we're as bold as John. I wonder if in our discussions, if we were talking with somebody and they said to us, well, I'll have you know I'm saved and I don't keep Torah. I wonder if we're bold enough to say, well, you're a liar. That's what John said.
Yeah.
Well, that ain't very Christian. That's what John said. Because people were already twisting the writings of Paul in Paul's day, because Peter warned against it. They were already twisting the writings of Paul. And they were saying, I've been saved by grace, but I don't have to keep Torah. And John says, if you don't desire to keep Torah and you're saying you know him, you're a liar. You can't know the Messiah I walk with and not desire to keep Torah. That's what John preached, James preached, Peter preached, and that's what Paul preached. They all gave Paul the right hand of fellowship because Paul's preaching the same thing. I want to show you an example of Paul preaching the same thing before we move on in Galatians. Go to Ephesians 2. I say I want to show you. I know you know it's there. Let's look at it together. Ephesians 2. Verse 8. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourself. It is the gift of YAHWEH, not of works, lest any man should boast. It can't get any more plain than that. That salvation is by grace through faith. Salvation is not by works. It's the gift of Yahweh. No man can boast that he earned his salvation by anything he did. No man ever can boast of that. But read the next verse. For we are his workmanship, created in the Messiah, Yeshua, unto good works, which Yahweh has before ordained that we should walk in them. So, Paul said to those in Ephesus, yes, we're saved by grace through faith. But being saved, we have been created in Yeshua HaMashiach. We've become a workmanship of Yahweh unto good works. Well, good works, what are you talking about, Paul? He said the good works that Yahweh before ordained that we should walk in. A clear reference to Torah. It's as simple as it can be that Yahweh recreated us in the Messiah and gave us a new heart, replaced our stony hearts as is prophesied, and put in our hearts and in our minds the law or Torah. We are his workmanship, created unto those good works which he before ordained. It was ordained that we should walk in them. If a man says, I've been saved by grace through faith, but does not walk in those good works which Yahweh has before ordained that we should walk in, John says he's a liar. Paul's saying, Ephesians 2:8, yeah, if you're saved by grace through faith, then there are those things Yahweh has already ordained you're supposed to walk through or walk in. You know, in today's evangelism, men claim they say a prayer and it proves they're saved. But as I stated earlier, there is a straight gate that has a narrow way. And that narrow way is defined in Torah. And if you think you came through a straight gate and yet your life does not then become defined by what Torah says, you've deceived yourself. Let me say it this way. If you claim you came through that straight gate, but you celebrate the same holidays the world celebrates, how is that a narrow way? If you claim you came through the straight gate, but you worship on the same day that Constantine dictated, the same day that the whole world said you're supposed to worship on, how is that a narrow way? If you say you came through the straight gate, but you eat the same things the world eats, how is that a narrow way? You're not walking the narrow way if you're doing the same thing the rest of the world's doing. The narrow way will make you a peculiar person. You'll celebrate different days than they celebrate. You'll worship on different days than they worship. There are things you will eat and things you won't eat. There are things you know to be food. There are things you know not to be food. You become peculiar. Paul preached salvation by grace to the Gentiles, but he also preached that they were then to walk in the good works that Yahweh had before ordained they should walk in. So let's go back to Galatians 2 and look in verse 9. He says, they would take this message to the circumcised. And he says, I would take this message to the heathen. That is, the Greek word there is ethnos. That means all the nations who are not Jewish, aka the heathen. There's the Jewish, and then there's the non-Jewish. They're going to take a message to the Jewish people, to the circumcised. I'm going to take it to the heathen. So verse 10, only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do. They didn't have to tell me to do that, but they did, and that's fine. We were going to do it anyway. Now we're going to focus the rest of our attention on Peter and Paul's confrontation. Verse 11. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. If you're going to get in Peter's face, you better make sure he was guilty of something. Paul said he is guilty. He is to be blamed. So I got in his face. Verse 12. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. Now, before we look at what Paul said to Peter, which is in the verses that follow, let's talk about what Peter did and why he did it. It says he came down to Antioch. And Antioch is an assembly that's made up of some Jewish believers, mostly Gentile believers. While he's there, Peter and the Jews who have been brought into the assembly, they eat with the Gentiles. They fellowship together, they eat together, they share meals together. But it says there were some Jews who came down from James out of Jerusalem, and when they showed up, Peter would no longer eat with the Gentiles. He avoided them. He set a boundary so as to stay away from them. Now, to understand why Peter did that, let's go to Acts 10, because he'll explain to us why he did that. It has to do with the first Gentile's home he ever went into. What was his name? Say again? Cornelius. That whole unclean animal in the sheet dropping down thing was for the very purpose of preparing Peter so that he would go into the house of a Gentile. Had nothing to do with eating a ham sandwich. Yeah. Acts 10 verse 15. And the voice spake unto him again the second time, what Yahweh has cleansed, that call not thou uncommon. This was done 3 times, and the vessel was received up again into heaven. Now listen to that statement in verse 15. What Yahweh has cleansed, that call not you common. That's very important. What has Yahweh cleansed? Has he cleansed a pig? No. Show me where. Has he cleansed shrimp? Show me where. Has he cleansed a lobster? Show me where. Has he cleansed catfish? Show me where. No, he didn't cleanse any of those, but we will watch him cleanse Cornelius and his household. And that's the message Yahweh is getting across to Peter. What I have cleansed, don't you dare call it common. Okay? Now, while Peter doubted in himself what this vision which he had seen should mean, that is, he's thinking on it because he definitely knows it doesn't mean he can go down there now since he's hungry and eat a ham sandwich. 3 times he saw this vision. 3 times he was told, rise up and eat. 3 times he said, no. Actually, no, sir. Nothing unclean has ever touched my lips. 3 times he refused to do that. So he knows it doesn't mean go eat something unclean. He's trying to understand what the message is. He said no, and so let me pick up again verse 17. While Peter doubted in himself what this vision which he had seen should mean, behold, the men which were sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house and stood before the gate and called and asked whether Simon, which was surnamed Peter, was lodged there. While Peter thought on the vision, the Spirit said unto him, behold, 3 men seek you. Arise, therefore, get thee down and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them. It's very important to understand what the Holy Spirit, what the Ruach HaKodesh said to Peter right there. Because had the vision not come, had he not had the vision and had he not heard the Ruach HaKodesh, he would not have gone to that man's house. Right. There is no way he would have went. But because of the vision and because of the Ruach HaKodesh, let's stop and talk about this for just a second. I think it's important to make a distinction. If you go back and read that whole thing where the sheet comes down, it very clearly says, a voice said to him, rise up and eat. And he follows Torah, not a voice in his head. Are you with me? A voice said, rise up and eat. And he said, no. But then right here, the Ruach said to him, behold, 3 men seek you. Rise and go with them. He understood the difference between a voice and the voice of the Ruach. Yes. He obeyed the Ruach, the Holy Spirit. He obeyed that and did what it said. But just because something rises up in your heart, you better discern where that came from, right? He knew that the voice that was telling him to rise up and eat contradicted what Torah said. Mm-hmm. He stuck with Torah, right? Anyway, without the vision, without hearing the Ruach HaKodesh, he wouldn't have gone, and we'll see why he wouldn't have gone in a moment. Verse 21. Peter went down to the men which were sent unto him from Cornelius and said, behold, I am he whom you seek. What is the cause wherefore you are come? Why'd y'all come? They said, Cornelius the centurion, a just man and one that fears Yahweh and of good report among all the nations of the Jews, was warned from Yahweh by a holy angel to send for thee in his house and to hear words of you. Notice Cornelius is a just man. A just man is one who does what is right. There's only one definition of what's right. And it's defined in Torah. Sin is a transgression of what's in Torah. So if he's a just man, Cornelius is a man who's seeking to walk uprightly according to Torah. But a man, no matter how much he seeks to walk uprightly according to Torah, can never get saved doing that. But he wants to be. And therefore, Yahweh sent a messenger to him. Ask for Peter. He'll tell you how to do this. And so, here Peter comes. Because here you got a man wanting to keep Torah, wanting to do what's right. But he's got to find out how his past transgressions of the law get taken care of. He's got a debt's got to be taken care of. And Yeshua's the only one that can pay that debt for him. Well, he tells Cornelius to ask for Peter, which he does. Verse 23. Then called he them in and lodged them, and on the morrow, this is Peter with the messengers, and on the morrow Peter went away with them, and certain brethren from Joppa accompanied him. And on the morrow after they entered into Caesarea, and Cornelius waited for them, and had called together his kinsmen and near friends. And as Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him, fell down at his feet, and worshipped him. Peter took him up, saying, stand up! I myself also am a man. And as he talked with him, he went in and found many that were come together. Listen carefully to what Peter said. And he said unto them, you know how that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation. But Yahweh has showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. There's the explanation of the vision. The vision was used by Yahweh to teach me I'm not to call a man common or unclean. Notice the second thing. He said it's unlawful for a man that is a Jew to keep company with one of another nation. Where is it written in Torah that a man that is a Jew should not keep company with one of another nation? Where is that found in Torah? The answer is it's not. Nowhere in Torah are they commanded not to keep company with those of another nation.
Just the opposite.
Say again?
Just the opposite.
Just the opposite. They're told they're to be a light to the nations, right, Steve?
They themselves were aliens in a foreign country, so
yes, sir.
we are to treat others the same.
That they were to be the light. They were given the oracles of Yahweh and to be a light to the nations. And they were to, as they brought the other nations in, there was to be one law for them and the Gentiles, not two laws. They were all to live by the same Torah. So Torah doesn't say anywhere, as well put there, Right the opposite. Torah never says he that is a Jew is not to keep company with those of other nations. So where did Peter get that?
Tradition.
Jewish law. Paul in chapter 1, remember in Galatians 1, Paul said that he was of the Jews' religion. And he defined what that meant. The Jews' religion are those who despised and hated and were vicious enemies of the true assembly of YAHWEH. Those who followed Yeshua. They are enemies of that. They keep the oral law. We cannot overstate it, cannot say it too many times. Mark 7, Yeshua made it clear that those who followed the Jewish religion would take Torah and set it aside in order to keep their traditions. And they taught the doctrines of men as if they were commandments. Right? And so where did Peter get this idea that he couldn't hang out with somebody of another nation? It's in the oral law, which is treated as if it came straight from Yahweh himself. But it didn't. Okay? Part of the oral tradition. So as part of the oral law, Peter has been taught that to hang out with somebody from another nation will contaminate you, make you impure. In Matthew 15, we read of a woman from Canaan who came to Yeshua and begged him to heal her daughter. Said that she was vexed with a demon. Anybody remember how Yeshua responded? Very interesting. She came to Yeshua and said, "My daughter's vexed with a demon, heal her." And Yeshua answered her not a word. Didn't say anything. And the way it's worded there and the way it's written there, it seems that she just kept saying, "Heal my daughter." He wouldn't answer her. The situation made the disciples so uncomfortable that they said to Yeshua, not, "Hey, please do what she's saying." They didn't think he should do what she was saying or do what she was asking. They came to Yeshua and said, "Please send her away. She's irritating. Make her go away." And Yeshua answered and said to them and in her earshot, "I am but sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." She's not part of the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I am sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And the woman said again, "Heal my daughter." You will remember, Yeshua said it's not right to take the children's bread and do what with it? Feed it to the dogs. Dogs is a term used by Jews to refer to Gentiles. They called them dogs, unclean things. Yeshua said to her face, not right to take the children's bread, Israel, and feed it to the dogs, non-Israel. What did she say?
Even the dogs eat scraps of it.
Even the dogs get the crumbs. Yeshua marveled at her faith. He said, "Woman, be it unto you as you have determined." Right? Yeshua purposely did what he did. Not answering her, stating, "I'm here for the lost sheep of the house of Israel," calling her a dog. He purposely did what he did in an attempt to break down the barriers inside the wall, inside the minds of his disciples, who saw Gentiles as nothing but dogs that are to be discarded. They had been taught all of their lives to have no dealing with the Gentile. Another example is you can go and see where, the woman at the well, a Samaritan woman even. They marveled that he even talked with her. He was constantly tearing down walls. So when we read in Acts 10 where Peter said it's not lawful for a Jew to keep company with a Gentile, he is talking about the commandments of men that have been taught as doctrine, not referring to anything he can find in Torah. But by vision, Yahweh convinced Peter to go into Cornelius' house. Now, did Peter agree to rise and eat when he was shown the sheep? No. Because it would have been to violate Torah. Peter is explaining to Cornelius, I'm here because I was made to see I'm not violating Torah when I come into your house. I'm violating the law of the Jews, but I'm not violating Torah to be here. He wouldn't have violated Torah to be there. But he did violate the commandments of men to be there. Verse 29. Therefore, I came unto you without gainsaying. I love that word, gainsaying. I came unto you without gainsaying as soon as I was sent for. I asked therefore for what intent ye have sent for me. And Peter says no one can gainsay. What he means by that is there is no one who can doubt or dispute that when I was asked to come, I came immediately. I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to pray about it. I didn't have to have a counsel on it. There's nobody who can accuse me of hesitating. When they said come, I came. All right? Didn't have to be forced. I obeyed what Yahweh said. Verse 30. And Cornelius said, 4 days ago I was fasting unto this hour, and at the ninth hour I prayed in my house, and behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing, and said, Cornelius, your prayer is heard, and your alms are had in remembrance in the sight of Yahweh. Send therefore to Joppa, and call hither Simon, whose surname is Peter. He's lodged in the house of one Simon a tanner by the seaside, who, when he comes, shall speak unto you. Immediately, therefore, I sent to you, and you have done well that you're come. Now, therefore, are we all here present before Yahweh to hear all things that are commanded thee of Yahweh? What did Yahweh tell you to tell us? Then Peter opened his mouth and said, Of a truth, I perceive that Yahweh is no respecter of persons. But in every nation, he that fears him and works righteousness is accepted with him. In other words, he didn't just come after Cornelius because he's a dirty, rotten sinner. He's come after Cornelius because Cornelius fears him and works righteousness. That's important. Because you fear him and because you work righteousness, Yahweh sent me to you because you are a prime candidate for what I'm about to tell you. Not everybody is. The word which Yahweh sent unto the children of Israel, preaching peace by Yeshua HaMashiach, he is master of all. That word I say, you know, which was published throughout all Judea and began from Galilee after the baptism which John preached. How Yahweh anointed Yeshua of Nazareth with the Holy Ghost, with the Ruach HaKodesh, and with power, who went about doing good, healing all that were oppressed of the devil, for Yahweh was with him. And we're his witnesses of all things which he did, both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Him Yahweh raised up the third day and showed him openly, not to all the people, but unto witnesses chosen before of Yahweh, even to us, who did eat and drink with him after he rose from the dead. And he commanded us to preach unto the people and to testify that it is he which was ordained of Yahweh to be the judge of the living and the dead. To him give all the prophets witness, that through his name whosoever believes in him shall receive remission of sins. While Peter yet spake these words, see those words right there, he had to build it up, but what Cornelius had to hear is that through his name, whoever believes in him shall receive remission of sins. Cornelius needed remission of sins. While Peter spake these words, the Ruach HaKodesh fell on all them which heard the word. And they of the circumcision which believed were astonished, as many as came with Peter, because that on the Gentiles also was poured out the gift of the Ruach HaKodesh. What Yahweh had cleansed, do not call common. Yahweh cleansed Cornelius. He made Cornelius righteous by grace through faith. Peter is never to call such a man common or unclean. And he learned that lesson. In Acts 15, when the question about the Gentile converts was brought up, Peter reminded everyone there about his encounter with Cornelius and what Yahweh had done. And I'm going to read that, then we'll get back to Galatians 2. Acts 15:7, and when there had been much disputing, Peter rose up and said unto them, Men and brethren, you know how that a good while ago Yahweh made choice among us that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And Yahweh, which knows the hearts, bears them witness, giving them the Ruach HaKodesh, even as he did unto us. You know, I went into Cornelius' house. He believed, and when he believed, the Ruach HaKodesh was given to him. What Yahweh's cleansed, we can't call common. Verse 9. And put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. What Yahweh cleansed, we can't call common. Now, therefore, in other words, what Peter is saying in Acts 15 is the same thing Paul's saying in Galatians. Peter's saying not a one of them had to be circumcised before they received the Ruach HaKodesh. Not a one of them. They heard the word preached, they believed, in that instant they were cleansed by the Ruach HaKodesh. Now, therefore, why tempt ye Yahweh to put a yoke upon the necks of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we are able to bear? What yoke is he talking about in Acts 15? Is it the law? Well, that would be absurd, because the law is called holy, just, and good. It's never called a yoke. The yoke, a yoke's something you put on an oxen when you want them to plow. A yoke is made for doing hard work. In the next verse, we'll see what Peter meant by yoke. The yoke he is referring to is the idea that you have to do the law and earn salvation. The Jews couldn't do the law and earn salvation. Neither can the Gentiles. It's stated in verse 11. But we believe that through the grace of our Messiah, of our Master Yeshua HaMashiach, we shall be saved even as they. The yoke is salvation by works. We can't take that yoke and put it on the Gentiles and say, y'all got to do this, 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 and this, and this if you want to be saved. No. We're going to teach them the same thing we learned. We get saved by grace through faith. That's the remedy. So, Peter knows this. Back to Galatians 2. Peter knows this. He knows that if a Gentile has been cleansed, he's not to call or treat them as common or unclean. And when he gets to Antioch in Galatians 2, he demonstrates that he knows it, because he readily sits down and fellowships with them and eats with them. But then some Jews came from James in Jerusalem. They show up in Antioch, and Peter isolated himself from the Gentiles. And Paul tells us why he did it. Why did Peter do that? He was afraid. Verse 12, feared them of the circumcision. I want you to think about that for a moment, because Paul's given us a very important piece of information. He feared they of the circumcision. I want you to understand that fear is rightly founded. It's founded in reality. By that I mean, he had good reason to be afraid. The Jews he's referring to, maybe not that particular group of Jews, but the the Jewish operation, the Jews' religion that he's referring to, they had Stephen stoned to death. They've already had Peter arrested and intended to have his head cut off. They've already threatened Peter and told him, stop preaching in that name. They had John killed. Galatians 1, Paul tells us that this religion of the Jews attacked the assembly of Yahweh without ceasing, seeking to utterly destroy it. So when it says Peter fears them, understand Peter knew what they're capable of. If they get mad at Peter, they would not kill him for eating with the Gentiles. What they would do, which is shown that they did over and over again through the book of Acts, what they would do if they got mad at him for doing that, is they would get false witnesses to testify he broke Torah and then kill him. That's what they would do. They were always bringing up false witnesses to get rid of somebody they were sick and tired of having to deal with. Peter knew how evil and wicked and deceitful they could be. You know, when we hear others, or when we fear others and what they might say or think, we sometimes act like our fear is justifiable. Peter's fear involved life and death. Our fear involves maybe somebody saying something ugly about us. And we act like that's justified. You know, we might sit down at Sukkot and enjoy a glass of wine. Unless a friend or family member shows up who's Baptist. And then somebody offers us wine. No. Thank you, though. No. Right? We're afraid of what somebody's going to say. And we think that's justified. Peter had reason to fear. And Paul understood Peter's fear. He did. However, the influence that Peter had on Barnabas and the others was too great to ignore. Paul could not let him get by with it. Verse 14. When I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live after the manner of Gentiles and not as do the Jews, why do you compel the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? Let's talk momentarily about how this verse gets twisted. Then we're going to talk about what it says. Those who want to believe that they don't have to keep the law use this verse as a proof text. They say Jews are supposed to now live like Gentiles, which is free from the law, and the Gentiles are not supposed to live like the Jews who are bound by the law. That's the way people read that and interpret it. They say Jesus set us free from the law, both Jews and Greeks. So the Jews should live as the Greeks, and the Greeks are not to live as the Jews, meaning we've been set free from the law. But only the unlearned and unstable could interpret that verse that way. First of all, we know that Paul did not preach a message different than other apostles. Second, let me say this. If he didn't preach a message different from them, if these others never preached that you don't have to keep Torah, then neither did Paul. Second, all we have to do to understand this verse is look at the words used. The first word translated there, Jew, is Yehuda. We would say Yehuda or Judah. That word means to be from the tribe of Judah or Judah. Judah or Judah, the way we say it, Judah, just gets shortened to Jews. If you being a Jew from Judah, is what that means. So let's read it again here. If you being a Jew of Judah, live after the manner of the Gentiles, and not as do the Jews. A different word here. This word, Iudekos, means Judaically. not as do the Jews. You do not live Judaically. You do not live in the manner of the Jews. How do the Jews live?
Tradition.
Exactly. Paul is not let me back up and say it this way. We still have to understand the three groups that are operating. You've got the assembly of Yahweh, and it's referred to over and over and over again. There is an assembly of Yahweh who follow Yeshua, who keeps Torah. You've got the religion of the Jews who follow oral tradition. And then you've got the Gentiles who worship many gods. So Paul is saying to Peter, you're a Jew. And it says, you, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, not as do the Jews. You do not live Judaically. You're no longer following the Jewish traditions and the oral law. Why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? 3 times we get the English word Jew, but 3 different Greek words. This word here means a Judaizer. Iudazo. Best I can pronounce it. A Judaizer. Why would you compel the Gentiles as a Judaizer? A Judaizer is one who is compelling people to follow oral tradition. A Judaizer isn't somebody compelling people to follow Torah. That's the assembly. When Paul speaks of living as do the Jews, he's not talking about living according to Torah. He is saying to Peter, you're no longer committed to living according to the traditions of the Jews. Why in the world would you set an example here to these believers that they ought to follow these oral traditions? They're not founded in Torah. The Judaizer is not one who enforces Torah. He enforces oral law. Read the Gospels and see these Judaizers clash with Yeshua over and over and over again. Yeshua kept Torah but not their oral law, and it caused great conflict between the two. Paul's saying to Peter, I used to be a Pharisee who kept the oral law. I forsook it. You grew up heavily influenced by the oral law, and you have forsaken it. If you and I have forsaken it, why are you now, by your example, saying to these Gentiles that they should learn and live by the oral law? I'm going to close here because verses 15 through 21 deserve more time than I'm prepared to give it today, and probably more time than you're prepared to give it in the chairs you're sitting in. But let me summarize what we've talked about so far. First of all, according to verse 2, Paul's message and the message of the other apostles was the same message. Second of all, the only ones who think that a man has to be circumcised to be saved are those who follow the Jewish religion, not those who are a part of the assembly. The true assembly of Yahweh has never taught that a man has to be circumcised to be saved. No one who is a true believer in the assembly of Yahweh believes that salvation is by any other means than by grace through faith. Though we often get accused of preaching salvation by works, it's a false accusation. Not once have we ever preached that. Salvation is by faith through grace, not of works. But we do believe that when a man is saved, he becomes a workmanship of Yahweh, created unto good works, which Yahweh had before ordained that he should walk in them. We believe that when a man enters the straight gate, he has been instructed to walk in a narrow way. We believe that if a man says he knows Yahweh and he's not, if a man says he knows Yahweh and he says he has been saved, but he has no desire within him to keep the commandments, then that man is a liar. We believe that it's impossible. We'll talk about it with Paul here in just a second. It's impossible to say, I know him, and not be changed on the inside. The third thing I'd say here in summary is that Paul confronted Peter about returning to the Jews' religion. His condemnation of Peter has to do with believing that men are bound by the oral law of the Judaizers. That's where their conflict came in, not over Torah. There's no mention of Torah in the exchange between these two men. None. The confrontation is over that which is taught by Judaizers. If Paul didn't think the Gentiles should be taught to follow Torah, then I have a few questions I'd like for people to answer for me. If Paul didn't think the Gentiles should be taught to follow Torah, then how do you explain this? Why did he teach them in assemblies that gathered every Sabbath? Why did he have Timothy circumcised in Acts 16? If he didn't believe that the Gentiles should be taught to follow Torah, why did he take a vow and shave his head to prove to the Jews that he walked in obedience to Torah? Why did he still keep the feast? If keeping the feast was just a Jewish thing, would he not be a hypocrite for confronting Peter about doing Jewish things and then him doing Jewish things? There was a difference between what Peter was doing and what he did. Peter was following oral law. Keeping the feast is obeying Torah. Why did Paul, don't know why my voice went high there. Why did Paul talk about being ordained to walk in good works that were before set aside by Yahweh? A clear reference to Torah. Why would Paul say that Yahweh has ordained that we walk in those good works if he didn't believe we were to keep Torah? If Paul thinks that Torah is not to be followed, why did he say in Romans 7, why did he say in Romans 3 that the Jews have a great advantage? He said this in Romans 3, I'm going to read it. What advantage then has the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Much every way. Chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of Yahweh. A Jew and a Gentile can both be saved. They're saved by grace through faith. But once they're saved, the Jew has an advantage because all his life he's been taught Torah. The oracles were committed to them. They have an advantage. The Gentile has to start from scratch. Why did Paul say that the law is holy and the commandments holy, just, and good if he believed that the Gentile didn't have to be taught that? If Paul believed that the Gentile didn't have to be taught Torah, why did Paul say that it is the carnal mind that will not subject itself to the law of Yahweh? He said that in Romans 8. The carnal mind cannot and will not subject itself to Yahweh's law. Why did Paul say in Romans 8 that when we walk in the Spirit, we fulfill the righteousness of the law? The Ruach HaKodesh does not set us free from the law. The Ruach HaKodesh empowers us to fulfill the righteousness of the law. If Paul did not believe the Gentiles ought to be taught Torah, why would Paul say in Acts, I believe all things written in the law and the prophets? Why would he say that if he no longer believes some things that were written in the law and the prophets? The point is, Paul's enemies in his day accused him of not keeping Torah, not teaching Gentiles to keep Torah. It was a lie, and it's still a lie told to this day. Paul always taught those who accepted Yeshua that they are to follow Torah. Peter and Paul never had any disagreement about keeping Torah. None. Paul had a disagreement with Peter about his unwillingness to shake off the last shackles of the oral traditions of the Father. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace as his name is put upon you. So has he himself.